Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm Alex Epstein. Today's topic is best case, worst case thinking. That's best case, worst case thinking. Now, this is a practice. This is one of those practices, and I always talk about this kind of thing, that it's something I had a lot of success with for a while, and then for various reasons, I just forgot about it. And I started resurrecting it recently, and it reminded me of how much I love it and how good it is at generating good creative ideas and how good it is at helping me avoid fairly obvious mistakes that save me a lot of time, money, and any other kind of value. So the basic idea of best case, worst case thinking is it's based on best case scenario, worst case scenario thinking. And the basic idea of it is that by thinking through the best case scenario, and it can be anything, but today I'm going to focus on planning a week, which is probably my favorite application of this, or at least my most common application of this. If you think about the best case scenario, what happens is it opens you up to positive possibilities that you never imagined and also creative ideas that you never imagined. So I'll go into both of those, but positive possibilities and creative ideas. And then worst case scenarios thinking is super valuable because it makes one aware of mistakes that are predictable, but often not predicted. And I'll go into some detail about that. I'll just say from the outset, and then I'll discuss this more at the end, best case scenario, worst case scenario thinking. This is something that you can apply to anything. Like you can do it to different kinds of personal relationships, long-term goals, any kind of decision. But I'm going to focus primarily on looking at a week, since planning a week is something that just about all of us do. And I find this a very helpful thing, along with some of the other routines I've talked about, including positive focus and the altitude walk, both of which I'm still enormous fans of, and this complements those very, very well. So I'll just walk you through my own application of this, at least just a little of it that I've done this week to plan my week, since I find that often just a concrete example is the most useful way of conveying something, and then you can, of course, apply it to your own details. So I think about, okay, what is the best case scenario of this week? How can I, what can I imagine as the best case? What would be really amazing? And at the end of it, I'd say, wow, that really exceeded my highest expectations. Now, I should make a note that I think of the best case scenario is it's primarily about if I make the most of the known possibilities, including acting to the best of my ability. So what it doesn't mean is that some amazing external event happens. So somebody really appreciates my work and says, I want to hire you for a speaking tour of 50 cities at double your normal rate. Like, okay, I can imagine that, and that would be great, but it's not useful for planning. It's actually anti-useful if in any way I'm counting on these kinds of magical things to happen. So it's really all about, okay, what are known possibilities, like within the context of known possibilities, and including if I act to the best of my abilities, what could happen? So I tend to think about the things I'm working on now. You could think of things you might do, but often we have projects that we're working on. So I just think about, okay, well, what could go really, really well this week? So one of my projects is the moral case for fossil fuels 2.0. So the completely redone version of the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, that I've been working on pretty solidly for a year and a half. And it's going very well for those of you asking. So one of the things that I have going on this week is I have 2 meetings with my main consultant for the book, who, at least at the moment, shall be anonymous. At some point, I won't be anonymous, but I'll just leave you guys in suspense if anyone cares. But in any case, okay, we have 2 meetings scheduled, and I think about, okay, best case scenario is both of those meetings are super productive, and I get really good guidance on the chapters of the book that I'm trying to really finish up now, and that's chapters 3 through 7. Okay, so I think about that, and that's useful to think about what I want. And because I already have the mindset of I'm making the most of known possibilities, this isn't something that's totally outside the realm of possibility, but nor is it something that's at all inevitable. And so part of doing the best case scenario is asking myself, okay, what actions will make this happen? Or even better yet, what actions will make this inevitable? And so what I think about is, okay, one thing is the meetings will be better the more valuable materials I send to this person. So I've already sent reading materials in terms of chapters I want read, but there are some questions on my mind that are kind of disorganized right now. And if I spend 30 minutes just organizing those questions and sending them to him, preferably by the end of tonight, but there's some value even doing it by the end of Monday night. If I can do that, then that will make the meeting much better, because then my confusions will be articulated and certain goals that I'm having trouble achieving will be articulated, and then that will bring his brain power to bear on those in addition to the comments he would give me on the chapters. So I just think by doing this best case scenario, I'm thinking about, okay, yeah, I would love it if we have these amazing meetings, what actions are needed to make these meetings amazing? And I just find that, oh yeah, I think of things, and often with the kind of work that I do, insofar as I'm collaborating with different people on things, I find a lot of the best case scenario actions are just doing an action, a proactive action, doing that, and then doing it earlier than I might otherwise do. That's at least a trend that I notice for myself. I don't know if it's universal, but for what it's worth, that's a trend I noticed. So another one is I have an interview. I have an interview this week scheduled with an economist whom I'm very intrigued by on Power Hour, and I can imagine, yeah, that would really be a fantastic interview, and it'd be fun, and I would learn a lot, and the audience would learn a lot. And so I think about, okay, what do I need to do to make that inevitable, or at least likely? And so one is he sent me some really good review materials, and so I want to really have reviewed those in advance so I can think about questions I'm most enthusiastic about. So that means, okay, at the latest by Monday night, but I'm recording this on Sunday, preferably at least by tonight, get started on that. Because sometimes if I'm really last minute with the show Power Hour, I'll do it the day of, but then that's really making the best case scenario a lot less likely. Because if I'm really prepared ahead of time, I can go back and forth with them on certain topics rather. It's just so much better. And it's just as I start to think about, okay, what would make it inevitable that this goes great, then I'm really motivated to spend the time at the time when it's most leveraged. So this is another case where it's the proactive time. It's not necessarily a huge amount of time, but it's a really big thing. Another thing that follows the same pattern, and again, your mileage may vary. I think, okay, well, I want to release some really good talking points this week on climate. If anyone wants to know my thinking on energy, you can go to energytalkingpoints.com, and we have some on climate, but we have a much more elaborate version that I want to get done this week if possible. And then I want to do some on reliable electricity, which I've drafted, but we need a bunch of refinement, and that's very relevant since, unfortunately, California is experiencing very unreliable electricity. But I think it's really important for people to learn the lessons of that. So what I need to do, it's something, again, where proactivity is good. I'm working with my colleague Stefan Henna on these, and it's just make sure that I review the latest stuff Sunday night so that I can give guidance for the work on Monday. So if I wasn't doing this best case scenario thinking, it would be really easy to postpone stuff, and in particular for me this week, because I happen to be on a little break/retreat, and so that ends Monday night, and so there's a tendency to do some of my planning on Monday instead of Sunday. But in this case, since everyone else's week starts on Monday, it's very valuable to have this stuff done by Sunday at the latest. So these are just all cases where if I do these things, the week is just going to be so much better in this respect. And there are other a couple of other categories. Another one is make a big financial decision with confidence. So there's a financial decision in terms of purchasing something that I want to make, and really make sure that I think it through. And if I make it, which I would like to be able to make it, then it's okay, I've really thought this through, and I've thought through, including what's the best case and what's the worst case scenario, which I'll talk about in a minute, making sure that's done well versus just on an impulse. So, and this is another case where best case is helpful. In this case, I'm not fantasizing about the specific thing, but I'm fantasizing about, hey, what it would be like to make the decision in a way that I'm really, really confident about. And I know I'm making this decision, and I'm really confident about my financial security, and I have different kinds of contingency plans if necessary. So there are a bunch of other things like this. Let me just see. Okay, and one more is, okay, I want to have a really fun weekend next weekend. And in particular, I would like to go paragliding, which I wanted to do on my birthday weekend and didn't happen for reasons I discussed on the last episode. But I would like to do that. And that's just the kind of thing where, okay, I have to plan that, contact my friend who might go with me. And in general, I'm a big fan of, if you listen to the Playtime Planner episode or the, I think that's the one where I talk about the tragedy of weekends and how much those get wasted. Yeah, I'm a really big believer in planning out the weekend. So it's the kind of thing, okay, I got to discuss that with my girlfriend, what we want to do in our time together, and then what I want to do in my alone recreational time. And just that's going to be something where if I block out the planning of that early in the week, it's almost guaranteed that the weekend will be awesome. But to go to worst case scenario, I know that if I don't do that, the weekend could be not nearly as good as I would like. So let's just jump to worst case scenario, and I'll use that example, and often these things overlap. So remember, the best case scenario is about thinking about, okay, if I make the most of known possibilities, including acting to the best of my abilities, what can be a really great week? And just thinking about the different aspects of life. And we find that, okay, it opens us up to certain kinds of possibilities or better versions of possibilities that we have. And it also often leads to thinking about actions that will make success likely or inevitable. And then it often has implications for the timing of those actions. And so we'll end up doing different actions and often with different timing because we're thinking in terms of these best case scenarios. Okay, now worst case scenario thinking. So worst case scenario thinking, if we go to this, I'm just moving to the right portion of this. The worst case scenario, what I'm thinking of, it's similar to the best case scenarios. I'm not primarily thinking about external dramatic things that are completely unexpected that could happen. So it's not, okay, a loved one dies or something like that, where that would be just terrible. And I could just make up worst case scenarios. Now that's useless to do, and it's like the imaginary best case. It's worse than useless. But I really want to think about what is the worst case scenario in terms of known negative tendencies that I have and that others I interact with have. Those aren't the only things you can think of, but I find those super, super valuable. So it's so one example is just, I mentioned the weekend, which is, okay, I have a poorly planned weekend and it's not as enjoyable or satisfying as I would like. Now you could think, okay, that's not a tragedy, but it's not about avoiding tragedy necessarily, but it's about really making the most out of life. And so I know that, okay, weekend is poorly planned, and so what's going to be the cause of that? So that's the kind of question I ask. Okay, what will cause this bad outcome? And it's going to be parallel to what I mentioned earlier if I don't plan it in advance. So I leave it until the weekend to plan it, and then it's a lot harder there's certain plans that you can't do, and it's just not nearly as fun to, at least for me, to plan the weekend on the weekend. I find it much less motivating, and the outcome is almost always worse. So it's a very easy thing to anticipate, and yet it's useful to anticipate that. Okay, another thing for me is gaining weight. Now that might seem weird for a 1 week goal, but I've been in a situation in the past couple weeks where I've gained a little bit of weight. It's no big deal, but there's just a certain trajectory, and I don't want to go into the different causes of that, although having a very luxurious food on my birthday certainly is a kind of contributor to that. But it's this kind of thing where, oh yeah, well, if I don't change anything, then it's going to be, then I'll keep gaining weight, and then I will not like that. That will be very not ideal. And so I just think about, okay, well, what would cause that? And part of what would cause that is just not having the right groceries in the house and then feeling compelled to order out or something like that. And so, okay, what's the solution? I just can put on my calendar, spend 15 minutes, make an Instacart order for like frozen vegetables and the other things that I need to supplement my meal service, which is thistle. And then, then I'll totally have everything in the house. And then I will, then I'll just go back to being on my normal healthy eating routine and potential crisis averted. Now notice these are not things that are necessarily crises, but they're important things to deal with. Another one for me is getting overwhelmed by my weekly commitments. So I have a combination of things that I do that some are weekly, like this podcast I do bi-weekly, my other podcast, Power Hour, I do weekly, and I have a newsletter that I do weekly, and these are valuable and I enjoy doing them, but they're something where if I leave them to the last minute, then they can easily eat into the time that I prefer to spend writing from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. That's the range of time. Sometimes it's just 7 to 11 or 7 to 12, but that's the range of time I find that I write best. But if I have an obligation, if I leave it to the last minute, then I'll have to eat into a bunch of that time, and then that'll make it harder to write that time. And that's a significant impediment to my week. So I think, okay, well, what's going to cause this? It's going to cause this if I don't do the main prep for this stuff one of the evenings, which is usually what works well. So it's just, okay, let's block out 15 or 20 minutes to do the prep for these and then assign anything I need to assign, and then set aside another block to do the execution, and then everything will be smooth. So those are some examples of my best case, worst case scenario thinking for this week. Maybe those strike you as not dramatic enough, but that happens to be what's going on with my week. And I can definitely tell you that the best case scenario I described for me will be very enjoyable, and the worst case scenarios would be a major bummer to go through, and they would certainly make me less productive, which would have negative ramifications for future weeks. Now let me talk about some other applications just so you can think about this, and these will often be more dramatic. I find best case, worst case scenario thinking very valuable for interpersonal issues, particularly commitments, and particularly in the realm of work. So if you're thinking about, if I hire someone, what's the best case scenario? But I think it's particularly useful to think about what's the worst case scenario. Often hiring is a situation that's prone to infatuation, which just means, okay, I can only see positives, or it can also be sometimes people are hiring in situations where they're desperate and needy, so they'll tend to overlook certain things. And so a worst case scenario is super useful for that. And you just can say, well, okay, given what I know about people in general and this person in particular in this situation, what's the worst case scenario that can happen? And often you'll just think of things that are pretty obvious. They're the kinds of things that you'll come up with later when the thing goes badly, and you say, yeah, I kind of always knew that would happen. Well, why not catch that early? And remember, in best case scenario thinking and worst case scenario thinking, one of the big benefits is it generates ideas. So it's not just, think this through, think about what can happen that's bad, but think through, okay, how can I avoid many of the downsides? And that's pretty easy. So if you think about it in a hiring context, it can just be, for example, okay, let's do a test project before making a long-term commitment. And then also, let's say I'm worried about, I'll get too overly excited and I won't have good judgment about this. Then I can be, okay, I'll just bring in some external person who's unbiased. And maybe I'll just have an explicit standard stated in advance for the test project, so then I can evaluate the person. Okay, how well did this person do on the project? And I have this other person looking at it from an external perspective who doesn't have any of the kind of biases that can get involved in hiring. Another context in which you can use best case, worst case is with a project. So I've done some of this with the new version of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels in terms of asking, okay, what's the best case scenario in terms of what this book is and what kind of impact it has. And one thing that I've come up with doing this kind of thinking is it's really important to me that it's retainable by the audience. One of my issues with the first one is I don't think it was nearly retainable enough. And then that's been such an interesting source of creativity because I have this idea, okay, it has to be retainable. And then it really leads me to improve the logic of it, to have better summaries at different points, to really think more about, okay, what's really the clearest way to explain this point so someone will be able to retain it and take it with them. So I found that the blue sky thinking of, okay, best case scenario, it opened my mind up to things I hadn't really thought of. And then once I think of them, I can think about, okay, well, how do you do that? And it's often the case that thinking about a goal, like once a possibility exists and I can think about, this really could exist. And then I think about, okay, if this exists, like I can almost imagine, okay, this exists already in my mind. What had to happen to get me there? Or sometimes it can be just, what exactly does this look like to be retainable? It might be, well, somebody asked to summarize the book, could easily summarize it in 1 sentence or 4 sentences. Or it might be that, I could just put that summary at the end of the book, or I could put a summary at the end of the chapter. It just leads to all of this creativity that wouldn't happen if I just said, okay, I'm just doing this book and I'm going to do the book and I'm going to make it good. The best case scenario opened up all of these potential values and also all of these creative ways of achieving those potential values. So that is an introduction to best case, worst case thinking. Hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to know anybody's experiences with this, either past experiences you've had applying this or experiences you have going forward. It's really remarkable to me when I do this how fruitful it is and how much positive possibility there is in life that we can pretty easily achieve, but won't unless we think this way or some comparable way, and also how many avoidable mistakes there are that are just really, they're like really predictable if we go through the process that eliminates any kind of blindness we have for predicting those kinds of consequences. So hope you enjoy that. As always, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. To get the updates for when new shows come out, go to humanflourishingproject.com. To discuss these issues on Facebook, and one great way of sharing your ideas and experiences, go to facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project. So when you're planning your week, planning a day, considering a different, considering a relationship with somebody, thinking about a project, try thinking about what's the best case scenario, what's the worst case scenario, and see what results you get. Good luck. I will be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.